Welcome to this fireside chat about sustainable urban transport challenges and opportunities in African cities. My name is Nicola Medimorek. I'm Director on Data Analysis and Research at the SLOCAT Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport. This topic today will be discussed by the SLOCAT-VREF Young Leaders on Sustainable Transport, which is a program that was brought alive by SLOCAT and the Volvo Research and Education Foundations, or VREF in short. Together, we launched this program to build bridges between the transport community and young professionals. The idea is to explore new perspectives and create an interface between knowledge and policy. At the end of 2021, we recruited 5 new young leaders. They are Bianca Weisek, Gabriel Tokam, Fatoumata Diallo, Richard Uniboje, and Robert Ambunda. I would very much invite you to explore their profiles on SLOCAT's Young Leaders page that I will put in this link description of this video, and also in this article that accompanied this video. All of them are PhD students or very recent PhD graduates who have a focus on mobility in Africa. In the next 50 to 60 minutes around, we will discuss this topic on how to best enable sustainable urban transport in African cities. The discussion will provide very valuable inputs to the climate change processes that we will face and encounter in the following months. To kick off the discussion, I would like to invite Fatoumata, who's based in Paris, to outline the approach that the French capital currently implements. So Fatoumata, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for this great introduction. I just wanted us to start off with the discussion with one of the hottest, most spoken about trends in urban planning regarding mobility, which is that of the 15-minute city, which has been increasingly associated to Paris, where I'm based. So I'm going to quickly define what it is and then tell you a bit more about how it works in Paris and what I think can be a good starting point for us to discuss and a good list of challenges that we might encounter if cities in Africa were interested in going in the same direction. So basically the idea of the 15-minute city is something of a planning paradigm and almost a planning philosophy, which aims at reaching a state in which every citizen is within a 15-minute distance, either by foot or by bike, of 6 essential social functions, which are working, housing, learning, shopping, as in getting supplies, entertaining, and this has been mostly reduced to sports, and also care and medical care, which is quite important in the current day and time. So it's not new or radical. It is the amalgamation of several other planning principles that we now know, which are the smart city, chrono-urbanism, polycentric cities, and even more directly, it is quite linked to the idea of the 20-minute neighborhood where everything should be, which made a lot of noise in the early 2000s and was notably implemented in Portland, if I'm not wrong. So the idea behind all of that is also to decenter technology-based solutions and just reorganize planning, not necessarily around social engineering, but around the hopes that the overall outcome will be an increased level of well-being within communities and an increased level of individual happiness, which is quite a big goal and quite a big challenge to take on. So the other goals, obviously more down to earth, are that of reducing greenhouse gas emissions because of a reduced number of kilometers traveled by a city dweller, but also reducing inequalities, which are fostered by the needs that some of us have to travel long distances to accomplish basic daily, tasks. And obviously promoting active modes, which are known to have many health benefits. So there are many ways to do so, and in Paris, it has, well, it can be qualified as a policy success. It has been qualified as such, at least internationally, not so much nationally, but I'm going to mention it a bit later. But basically, how it's worked in Paris is that first and foremost, it was politically heavily supported because it just, it was taken on by the political champion of the idea, Anne Hidalgo. So she's the mayor of the city. And she ran her re-election largely on different campaign promises in 2020, including that of the 15-minute city becoming a reality in Paris. And because that was such a huge objective for her, we kind of associated the idea directly to her. However, it's also important to mention political precedents. So when an idea exists before, well, like when a similar idea exists before the emergence of a concept, it obviously facilitates it, right? So it's often a part that is left out of the story, but in Paris, there has already been bureaus of time. So departments of the city council that wanted to make sure that the city dwellers' schedules were organized in a way that allowed them to actually enjoy the city fully. And that, like the elected officials working on that were trying to make sure that transport and commuting times were optimized, but also that public services were opened at the relevant hours, right? So maybe opening the pool much later than it was, because a lot of people who were employed couldn't afford to just go to the pool in the middle of the day, or opening daycare earlier in neighborhoods where parents went to work earlier. So that was that kind of philosophy that kind of pre-existed. And further, I also think that it's important to note how and why Paris was a bit of an ideal playground for the concept. So first of all, there's already quite a bit, like Paris is rather dense. There's a lot of built environment that is ready to be repurposed to ensure that when a building is not used for its primary function, it can be used to ensure one of these other social functions that are the 6 core components of the 15-minute city. And beyond that, it's not that big of a city, right? It also has a very dense transport system. And those elements were already kind of there laying the ground. It was also easier in a way because there was also that governance structure that existed, which is that of the arrondissement. So there are boroughs that are rather small, and small enough at least to represent those 15-minute radius type of units, right? And that they already had like a delocalized governance. So there are mayors per borough, for instance, right? So there's also something to keep in mind. And then mobility-wise, while we attribute the shift to cycling to the pandemic mostly in current discourse, I want to give this its flowers where it's due. We should remember and we should acknowledge the role of the massive 2019 strikes in pushing Parisians to bike. So at the end of 2019, pre-pandemic, there were massive strikes, massive social movements regarding quite a lot of issues. We'll not go into it, but basically the transport services were highly reduced for a large amount of weeks. And basically there was just a core minimum. It was very difficult to get around with the usual manners. So subways, trains, buses were basically unusable, and a lot of Parisians starting biking at that moment. So there was already that shift that had started, not necessarily, well, obviously at the same time as infrastructure for biking was prioritized politically, but also because there was this need to kind of find an alternative when we already were deprived pre-pandemic of the subway that is used so heavily in Paris, right? And then obviously when the pandemic hit, the need to stay closer to your home and just not rush into, and also this, you know, the whole thing with working from home and not having to commute as much, and maybe reorganizing your schedule differently, also invited a lot of people who did not have a bike yet to get one. It was actually very difficult to get a bike when the pandemic started in Paris. And an important component that is also part of the policy in Paris is that of the Corona lanes. That's how we call them. They were temporary bike lanes that were basically put in place all over Paris. So where there weren't bike lanes already, space was like substantial space was taken away from cars and other transport modes to make room for bikes, and they were largely used, and it was like nothing we had ever seen before. Another thing that is important to mention about the Corona lanes is the fact that it was not only within Paris, in the center of Paris, but it was also beyond and in the larger Paris region, where a lot of departments and a lot of areas that are much more peri-urban and that we didn't qualify as ideal places to bike in, actually took it upon themselves to also implement those Corona lanes. So it was beyond Paris, and that is interesting enough to note. Beyond all of that, and I guess that is a story that is quite known, I also want to address the challenges that the 15-minute city as a planning paradigm can pose, because I wouldn't be a social scientist if I didn't mention a bit of the criticism and the ruffle up that happened around the whole shift and the whole policy move that we've witnessed. So that can also be basis for discussion further when we try to understand how it can inspire us in several African cities. So first, it is the typical type of idea that tends to be turned into something of an empty shell if it is spread without its content, and if it is simply claimed for publicity and marketing purposes by city governments, and not claimed as an objective, as a sincere objective, and as a realistic policy goal. Further, it's important to note that it needs to be catered to the city's specific features. So as I already mentioned, what made Paris so prone to adopting that sort of philosophy. But I also feel like in very different cities, that sort of policy orientation could be adopted, but simply not exactly as it was in Paris or in any other city, because it simply wouldn't make sense. So there would be that need of reinvention that, well, is obviously common to most policies you wish to import as a policymaker, but that might be even more necessary here. There's also a deeper question that I feel we might ask ourselves, and that also highlights the need in the implementation of such big shifts to actually include the people and to push for more participation. Basically, the question here is, do city dwellers living in very big cities want a 15-minute city? That's also a question here, because it's a bit of a reproduction of something closer to a village than a city, if you think about it. So you're trying to have everything around you, by a 15-minute distance, and you're trying to foster more community and to know one another. And that was one of the criticisms addressed to the idea. So if you go to the big city and try to make it in the big city, do you want to be known by your neighbors, or do you want to actually work where you live, when, for instance, it is known that the commute, so either in public transport or biking or whatever it is, the commute represents this sort of space-time moment in which you transition from home and from what represents your home, so your neighborhood, to what is the workplace. And that is a conversation to be had locally, I believe, in each of the cities that would be potentially interested. Another major question that I feel is very relevant for African cities is that of sprawl. So as we know, in a lot of cases, mega cities are city regions. And what does the 15-minute city mean for people who live outside of the city, but have some of these social functions to accomplish within the city? So most, like in most cases, working mainly. And that is also a question that was asked in Paris. So a lot of people who use their cars within Paris use them because they do not have any other option to commute from where they live to the center of the city. And that was a source of resentment. Besides, a lot of the people who make those neighborhoods lively, so the people who clean the buildings, the people who take care of the schools, cannot afford to live inside of the city. So it also calls for much larger reform than we might think of. So there's obviously, simpler arrangements, such as putting together bike lanes and making sure that the place is walkable, but also making sure that the people who, make the neighborhood can live in it. And that is a much larger question here. And besides, it's also, it requires a lot of political will, as do every sort of transport project, especially if you're trying to take away space from cars and allocate it to active modes or allocate it to public transport modes. That is something that is already quite known and that has been faced in a lot of cities, but still important to remind. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on all of that and how that could help us think forward of new ways and new impulsions to actually promote sustainable transport in African cities.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview and also like already outlining some of the challenges that Paris has faced. And also, it's a great point that you made about, like, for example, that it's not a new concept. Like, as you mentioned, Portland, for example. Also, I'm based in Seoul, and Seoul has this approach of a 10-minute city. So everything should be within 10 minutes of a walking distance here. And then we have other examples like Singapore, where they aim for 20-minute towns and for a 45-minute city, where like everything should be accessible within 45 minutes of reach by public transport. And even if you look at Barcelona and Barcelona superblock system, it's also not so far away from a 50-minute city. Like also something that tries to build a compact city and tries to increase density and ensure access for very essential services within very short distances. So yeah, but I mean, as you can see, like I just mentioned, was Martha just mentioned, so like examples from Europe and Asia. So I'm now like wondering what are the challenges actually in African cities that prevent such compact city planning, that prevent the establishment of 50-minute cities. So I would like to go to Richard, for example. Richard, as you're based in Lagos, maybe you can share the perspective and the difficulties that one of the biggest cities in Asia and Africa actually faces in such concept.
All right, thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Fatimata, for your presentation. It was enlightening. Speaking regarding concerning the 15 minutes Paris or walking city, I think it's actually a very good concept to adopt, but I think it has its own criticism as well as has its own opportunities for rethinking transportation in African cities. One of the criticism that we've had about the 15 minutes walking city, it's such that sometimes some people say it's targeted towards the middle class and high income residents, and it doesn't really address the issues around inclusiveness, around people who or communities where facilities are already available, where they can just walk from their house to, access those facilities within walking distance. And in the situation of Lagos, for example, it's designed in such a way that our cities are monocentric, where we will have a major zone of residential areas, and we have the place of work, industry, and commerce. So we have this back and forth movement where you cannot adopt any form of non-motorized transportation for you to access things like jobs or essential services. You have to use either a commercial vehicle, you have to use a motorcycle, you have to use a tricycle. And so that factors into if the 15 minutes walking city can be applicable to the case of Lagos or many African cities, because we do exhibit the same attitude or the same concept of monocentrism, as I've stated earlier. And besides, the issue of gentrification as an after effect of the walking city is something to also be looked at. For example, in Lagos, within the campus environment of the University of Lagos, we have developments springing up because of campus environments. We have hair salons, we have cyber cafes, we have even residents are even becoming expensive. Places to live are becoming expensive as a result of the presence of the university campus. And if you want to have a 15 minutes walking city to be adopted in such an environment, it means that there is need to plan socially, involve people at the grassroots level, the low income earners, test it if you can have it tested in a particular place, so as to get how inclusive walking cities can be. And I think that it's a major challenge in Africa, because we have an issue of governance. Governance is an issue. Governance across mobility, governance across budgeting system, governance issues around how people access services. So we have so much reliance on the old means of transportation that we do. In Lagos, predominantly 90% of our travels are road-based. And if you're trying to move away or shift our attention from that into a walking city, laying emphasis on proximity, then it means that in Lagos or in other African cities, there have to be a reorganization of space. We need to reorganize our cities. And that takes a lot of commitment, as Fatima has said, as a lot of political will. And likewise, it has to involve a lot of people coming in to talk about how applicable this is. So if we're going to have the 15 minutes walking concept adopted in Africa, we need to look at it in the scope of housing. We need to look at it in the scope of transportation. We need to look at it in the scope of accessing essential necessities of life, basically. Yeah. So I think relating this to the concept of walking city to the issues in Africa, I think it's strictly a governance issue. So if we have our governance right, have our mobility plans right, alongside the budgeting system, it's something that African cities can actually emulate, at least at a small scale, before we look at amplifying it in other areas of other places in Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, you mentioned now issues like inclusiveness and also kind of gentrification, that it's important to involve people, and also like the issue of governance that you highlighted very much. Kind of the lack of commitments that really followed through. It's a very, very valid points, and I would like to hear some further challenges. Robert, is here based in between Namibia and South Africa, in both areas. So maybe you have some experiences or some challenges there from the Namibian and South African cities.
All right, thanks, Nicola. On my side, I think discussing the 15-minute city concept around mobility and transportation in many African cities, as may apply to Namibia and South Africa, accessing a city is not a matter of choice for most people. It becomes a matter of survival, as most of the inhabitants have to be in the city center and they have to travel for hours in order to access some of the jobs that are in the city center. I tend to think that the 15-minute city is truly a noble idea, but its targets may possibly remain elusive for most African cities because of, let's say with Namibia and South Africa, our historical and in some sense, our current context. So you tend to understand that emerging economies are plagued by chaotic urban planning. And as Fatoumata and Richard have also pointed out, there's quite a challenging political and administrative environment, which in some cases doesn't allow for rapid policy change to accommodate and in a sense implement some of these mitigating urban planning measures. So added to that, you also have challenges with regards to unintegrated and multimodal transportation systems that may not coordinate, which can also be underpinned now by inequalities in urban planning, mostly across many African cities. I think some of these challenges may severely limit the application of the 15-minute city concept in Africa. Another perhaps dimension to look at that will be critical on the equity front will be how we deal with elements of the negative environment externalities. So whether you take things like air pollution, how waste is treated, where waste is disposed, these are some of the things that the developed world perhaps does not have to grapple with to such an extent. But for countries in Africa, or most of them, these have an impact in the areas of the city that are likely to be more polluted than others. And the kind of population that is also exposed to these externalities versus those who are living in, I would say, greener areas. So it mostly points to how we can balance the 15-minute city concept being something that only benefits the people who are in the higher middle income category, and also how it can benefit people who are on the lower end of the city. So mostly those are the challenges that we have to deal with when it comes to implementing such a concept in Africa. Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, even though we have those challenges, it leads to certain opportunities that we can identify within those challenges that we can actually go forward and see how we can localize the 15-minute city concept for different cities in Africa. All right, thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very good points about the chaotic urban planning or kind of the political environment, which might not be the most preferable to enable such a concept or such a let's say planning approach. Then of course the coordination with transit, even like you mentioned the basic services, waste management, and such things are really kind of a huge issue. And we should never forget the topic about equity and equality that needs to be really for all people and not leave anyone behind. Also, you gave us already great keyword for the next focus topic of this discussion around opportunities. And now I really want to focus our discussion here on the opportunities that we have in African cities, on kind of a little bit, see if we can identify any opportunities, but also like low-hanging fruits or anything that might be good first elements that might enable a better or more compact city planning approaches. So I would like to invite Bianca, if you can share any ideas, any insights that you have from your professional work.
Thank you, Nicola. Can I briefly just go back to the challenges aspect, because there was
Of course,
one that
yeah.
wasn't mentioned that I was wondering
Yeah,
about.
please.
So I guess maybe it's different in some other African cities, but one thing I was thinking of in Cape Town was the equity aspect of the 15-minute city. So like not all facilities are created equal there. And oftentimes, depending on, like, for example, if you're talking about health, based on who your insurance is with, whether you're insured or not, depends on where you can go then to see like a doctor. So I don't know if anybody like knows more about like the nitty-gritty of the 15-minute city concept, like how it gets actually written out in policy. But if there is something currently where they do emphasize that these facilities do need to also be equitable. It's not like, you know, just because there's a supermarket somewhere and it's empty doesn't mean that there's a supermarket. Or like if it's like a Woolworths, for example, it's like one of the more expensive supermarkets in Cape Town, and that's not necessarily going to help people if you throw it in Kailicha. So yeah, just like thinking about what people's capabilities are in terms of those facilities within 15 minutes of them. Yeah, I don't know if that's like something that's emphasized in policy currently, but if it's not, I really think it needs to be, especially if we think about a Cape Town context where there are such stark inequalities across the city. Turning to opportunities, I guess, from that. Yeah, well, I mean, one opportunity definitely is that quite a few people do currently already have the habit of walking, maybe not necessarily because they want to walk. But there is definitely an opportunity to latch onto that and better understand their current barriers and motivations for walking, and removing those barriers that are currently in place if you do want to move towards that 15-minute city concept. The other thing, this is both like a challenge and an opportunity more, but is to also think about, I guess, the 15-minute city, like it's what Fatimata was talking about, where like, well, if we have these 15-minute cities, do people even want that? Because essentially what you're doing is these little bubbles of community, I guess. But is that a good idea in quite segregated cities? And what sort of opportunities are there for using that 15-minute city concept to rather like integrate people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, also like income backgrounds, so that it's not silos and pockets of people throughout a city. Once again, thinking more about like the stark inequalities in like the South African city concept. Yeah, maybe I'll halt there, give somebody else a chance to talk, and then I can jump back in.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, Tokam, if you want to please add any opportunities that you see maybe from Nairobi or other places. Are you there? I think, oh, Tokam, can you hear us?
Okay, now I can hear you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Good evening to everybody. I think thank you very much for Fatumata, Robert, and Richard for your intervention. Well, I think about the 15-minute city, you can really see that it's a matter of access to basic needs. Because when you talk about 15-minute cities, like I can get something, if I want something, I can get it in, I think, around 15 minutes of work from my home. So now we can start to thinking about, okay, why do I have cities and rural area? I think what I saw here in Kenya is that for some events like international conference and others, I think they try to diversify the area of intervention. Now, the majority of events are either organized now in Nairobi. They try to organize something in Kisumu, the Taisa, means that when people come to Kenya now, they are not focused in Nairobi because they start to think about, okay, why organize something in Kisumu? Why not in Nairobi? Why in Mombasa and why not in Nairobi? Because in their politics, they want to, I think, to promote the idea of sharing prosperity around the countries. I think this is what all African government should do and start to do in Africa, because I think we invest a lot in our cities with the bad politics, the bad policy in our cities. So I think now we should start to think about the shared prosperity in our cities. About now the opportunities of transport, there's a lot of opportunity in Africa. I think we are the country with the most young population in Africa, in the world. So I think how can we talk about walking and then Africa City has not leading in that area? We cannot understand. So you cannot, you can easily think that it's a matter of public policy, it's a matter of willingness of our government, it's a matter of leadership in Africa. So 2 weeks ago, I was doing a research about housing policy in Africa. I was wondering the fact that in Gabon, for example, 90% of the population are living in the urban area. In Gabon, 90% of the population, they live in an urban area. Is the same thing in Nigeria, 55%, in Cameroon, 55%. But how can our private sector doesn't invest in public transport? Because when you invest in public transport, we need to have a return on investment. You cannot construct BAT, you cannot construct a rail line, and then people doesn't take it. You cannot have MC buses, and then you continue to invest in them. So I think we have the market, we have the population that are here to pay for transport fare. I think now the government should follow and support the private sector in order to invest in those kind of initiative. I think the private sector shows their interest now about transport corridor in Africa. We can easily see them in East African countries, in West Africa. It works perfectly. I was in Dhaka working on a project of the World Bank. I saw that the private sector invests a lot in BFT project there. So, and then the funding agency and development partners support those initiatives now in Africa. So I think there is a lot of opportunity now, also with the ongoing global initiative about the UN Conference on Climate. We have the Sustainable Development Goals initiative. We have the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. We have all those frameworks that encourage, the implementation of sustainable transport in Africa. We also have the willingness of some governments in order to implement some strategy about corridor transport, and then we can just export them. I think actually I'm thinking about the Ethiopian government will invest a lot in public transport. We have the case of Kampala in Uganda. I think Kenya is on a good move here in Africa. We have also Dhaka with the train express, the latest one, the first one in Africa. You see that we have some African countries that are taking the lead in Africa. I think we should act more than we talk. I think actually the trend now in Africa is that our government, official, they like to attend to international conference about sustainable mobilities, about sustainable transport, but we don't act, we don't see the result. So I think those funding agencies should, push our government to act more than they talk. I think this the issue now in Africa is that we are strong to to organize international conference on sustainable development, but I think that we should be more practical in our city. I think we cannot demand to someone to leave his private car without proposing anything. I can't have my car. I know that every morning I need to travel from my home. I need to drive from my home to my office, and then you ask me to stop that. It's impossible without proposing me a reliable and affordable public transport. Yeah, so I think we should start by acting more than we talk. So those funding agencies should start by implement some small ideas. We should construct a cycling lane and try to show the people that okay, this is how we use this. We should try to implement some small ideas about the free day cars and something like that, and show the population that this is how we use those kind of infrastructures, because I think if you continue to talk, organize meeting, and without implementing some such small ideas, we cannot lead the sustainable transport in Africa. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very, very impressive inputs, and also like, yeah, kind of the main point is really we need to walk the talk and yeah, act and really implement something better. And also, like, already you mentioned a lot of good, also like actually best practices from the region, and that's something I want to discuss further with you. But maybe before we go to best practices, I wonder like if somebody else wants to add any opportunities or anything else that wasn't yet mentioned.
Absolutely. Regarding you know, what Tokam said about acting and what Nicola mentioned at the beginning regarding low-hanging fruit, while there might be things that require shifts, I believe that there are already practices that are well in place in a lot of places that we would just have to you know, make safer. So a lot of people walk, as Bianca mentioned, maybe not because that is their ideal mode of transportation, but either way, they're already walking. If walking in a lot of these cities was safer, maybe the aspiration to switch transport modes would be different. If walking was safer already, and obviously there are a lot of initiatives to ensure that there is proper walking infrastructure, but that could be even furthered, and notably through, you know, the new ways in which we can collect data. So trying to understand where people walk and where we don't expect them to be walking, for instance. So instead of considering that maybe people crossing very busy streets at a given place is reckless from them, asking oneself from a policy standpoint, why are people needing to cross at that specific place, and maybe understanding what can be done for them to be able to cross. If people are walking on the side of roads that are very busy, why not make sure that they can walk on these roads without fearing for their lives or that of their children? There is, you know, the question of safety on our roads, unfortunately, in Africa is not, you know, for now, it's you know, we're not achieving that many great results. Like we're among the regions in the world with like a lot of road accidents, and you know, starting from things that are already practices in everyone's daily lives, and maybe the same goes for cycling in some places too, like straying away from the idea that cycling is foreign to many African cities. When you know, for instance, in previous exchanges we had, I do remember Toka mentioning you know, like cycling practices that we didn't necessarily know about in given places. So maybe departing from what already exists and just making it safer and easier to do.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a very, very good point. So yeah, I would like to discuss with you some best practices, and especially also like focusing on best practices from the region, because also for policymakers and for yeah, stakeholders in Africa, some examples from Europe or North America and so on might sound very abstract or difficult to achieve, but sometimes we don't even need to look very far to find very good examples. Like Tokam already mentioned, the Dakar BRT. Kampala has a very great walking and cycling, or especially cycling infrastructure that they're currently building up. Ethiopia developed non-NMT, or like non-motorized transport strategy that they're going now to implement, and I believe there are many other examples. I would like to, yeah, if you want to share something more. I see Tokam, you already raised your hand. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. So I think about best practice, we can easily have them. I think in East Africa, they are more receptive to the kind of mode of transport, about sustainable mobilities, e-mobilities. In East Africa, I think in South also, in East and South Africa, they are, I think they are more eco-friendly. From my experience, yeah, they are more eco-friendly about those kind of initiatives. So what I was saying before is that we have in Africa, we have a lot about talking about opportunities. In the past, 20 years ago, having a smartphone in Africa was something so extraordinary. But today, even at 10 years old, we have smartphone today. So we think that the internet coverage in Africa is actually now is something, it's not something extraordinary. So we have some basics from where you can go to act about what you want to do in Africa. Now I was discussing last time with a project manager in Tanzania, and he was wondering the fact that in Central African countries, so most Francophone countries, they are, I think, it's like when you talk about sustainable mobility, when you talk about road safety, for them is something very extraordinary. They don't accommodate that. You don't know why. I think it's a matter of practice. It's a matter of something. They just see it as on. They're watching on the TV, reading on the books, and they don't. The government there in Central African country, they don't invest a lot in those kind of in those mode of transport. So I think we have the availability of skill in those countries. So we should advocate for in our different countries for to help the government to implement, I think, small ideas. We should, like Fatimata Diallo was saying, we should implement small ideas. We already have the basis. We have the skills in Africa. How is it possible that in Canada and in Russia, they have 9 months of winter, and then they are able to have electric vehicles powered by solar system? How is it possible? In Africa, we don't experiment winter. We don't have those strong weather in Africa, and we are not able to power our vehicle with a solar system or aerial system. So I think what I will add is that it's just a matter of leadership. So we should train our leaders. We should advocate so that they can understand that it's a really need in Africa. Because without a reliable transport system, transport mode, we cannot talk about sustainable development of African countries. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Robert, please.
Cabral mentioned something that resonated with me there. And I think in the context of African cities, we have a very huge chance to implement something like the 15-minute city concept in an evolutionary manner, where we can have something of a 3-pronged approach, where we are not just talking about physical mobility and spatial proximity, but we are also talking about digital connectivity. As he mentioned that even today, a 10-year-old has access to a smartphone. And that's one area where the pandemic has also changed things a lot. People aren't just thinking about access to whatever it is with regards to locality and physical address, but also when it comes to digital connectivity. So in a way, in our adaptation of whatever form of the 15-minute city concept, we have to sort of embrace the informalities that are already in place and also try to build from there in order to try and integrate the new technologies with more labor-intensive industries. And in that way, we can also address some of the inequalities that are in place. So, yeah.
Yeah, anybody? Yeah, thanks. Anybody else wants to jump in on this one, or
yeah,
yeah.
I was about to mention the now known Open Streets initiative, which, while it's obviously a punctual thing to do, it's an organization that basically plans car-free days in given neighborhoods. So I know that they're quite active in South Africa, notably, and notably in Cape Town. And what's interesting is that it shows obviously how the neighborhood feels when there are no cars, but it's also made as a party. And it's also the occasion for people to discover, entertainment groups or small shops that are there in that area and that maybe you wouldn't know of because you're used to shopping elsewhere, things like this. So while these are punctual and they're not like long-term solutions, it's, I believe, still interesting and accessible also interventions that can even be prompted by citizens themselves.
Yeah, thanks. And also, I believe like that open streets events are really inducing a behavioral change, and they opening, they're broadening the mind of people and showing them there's different use of streets, and it's not just for cars, and yeah, there's much more than the movement of vehicles that's important in our cities. Yeah, not sure if anybody else wants to add any examples or any good practices, or maybe any things that they see as a priority that African cities should focus on.
One thing, well, I was thinking about the open streets thing, and then I thought about like there was a lot of larger cycling events also that did sort of the same thing. I know like in Nairobi, they have a cycling event. In Cape Town, they used to, I'm not sure if they still do, where people would get together and do like a mass bike ride. But also what was interesting was like in a few cities, more in Northern Africa, there were like through COVID, there were events that popped up to teach people how to cycle, because it is kind of difficult. And yeah, so they were teaching women how to cycle who wanted to learn that sort of thing, which I thought was really empowering, and also like a nice approach rather than like, oh, well, here's your infrastructure. We just built a bunch of bike stands and put bikes in place for you, but also enabling people who previously wanted to cycle but couldn't. Yeah, so yeah, teaching and skills building is really important. The same thing goes with the technology thing. If you want to think about the city in terms of like a 15-minute tech access kind of thing, also to think about the skills that might be needed to build up, in addition to the infrastructure, to build up around like enabling people to use their phones for more than just passive use cases, but also like actively using the web to interact with others and contribute to like online forums or whatever it is that they're using their tech to for whatever objective it is that they're using it for.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Anybody else who wants to share any inputs, any valuable insights?
Yeah, I was thinking also of the fact that maybe while it's not necessarily urgent to have the 15-minute city as a short-term horizon or anything, maybe the principles of the planning paradigm can be extracted from that and maybe infused into the thinking behind launching new projects and such. And I feel like that can be like that can go a long way. So I was thinking of the fact that one of the ways to promote the 15-minute city is to make sure that an equipment has several uses. And I was thinking of the fact that a lot of transport mass transit projects generally relocated or simply displaced informal merchants and people selling merchandise in those sites. But I'm realizing now, and obviously I'm thinking of examples that I've already read in the literature of transport hubs that are also commercial hubs. So thinking maybe of ways to ensure that these people who are usually displaced and who are, for instance, selling things like fresh produce are also included in those big projects, and maybe given the opportunity to turn their business around and have like some sort of a spot in like once the mass transit project is done. So that is also an opportunity to ensure that a commuter can also shop and vice versa, and to not focus on something that is very, because that is something I've witnessed, very like that has some sort of impetus for technological purity, and like this project is aimed for that, and you know there shouldn't be any competitors or any other uses in that given mass project. So just keeping the idea of making sure that the city is optimal for people's well-being might also go a long way, even if not all of the principles of the 15-minute city or the 20-minute neighborhood are adapted in future projects.
Yeah, thanks, Elton. I think it's maybe good way also to conclude this session and maybe a little bit to summarize, also very much linked to your last points here. Yeah, it's not, of course, not about completely forcing every city to apply this approach of a 15-minute city planning, but the principles are very much a very good overall approach, and if we see it in a bit more comprehensive manner, that it's about, you know, a compact city, high density, mixed use, and then also like very strengthen public transport, walking and cycling, and as well as try to really improve what you have currently on the equipment of the street network, and what the current city actually offers in terms of service, if it's in terms of official formal public transit, or if it's paratransit through informal services. We look at the strong vanguards of the voice shift and improve framework, which also I feel very well reflects and shows key features of such a more comprehensive and a more integrated as well as equal inclusive planning approach, and also like it's really in support of promoting sustainable transport. Yeah, I think we also identified lots of advantages and opportunities for African cities, if it's the young population or the strong drive towards urbanization, but also that strong drive towards more technology use, and already the strong use of technology overall, and then many others already enablers you can find in open streets event, critical mass, or like the cycling events and so on, as well as many projects that have been implemented in some regions, and that should be scaled up further in more cities around the region, and other regions as well. And then now a little bit also to get us back to the main introduction, where I mentioned the climate change processes. The reasons why I mentioned it there is because this year in 2020, the 27th Conference of Parties, the COP27, the big climate change conference, will be held in Egypt, and also in the next month, a month from now, we will see the MENA Climate Week being held in the MENA region, but also like it's Northern Africa participation, and then also we will have in April probably the Africa Climate Week. So like there are lots of events within this region happening in terms of climate change and sustainable development, and I hope that we can take this the findings and the information that we had in this session to these events, and to promote a more sustainable low carbon transport. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you again in future sessions. Thank you very much.